I can still hear his voice as clearly as if it were yesterday. My father, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, his arms crossed, his face unreadable, but his tone sharp as a knife. You'll never make anything of yourself. It was the kind of sentence that doesn't just pass through your ears. It burrows under your skin and settles in your chest, echoing every time you dare to dream too big. I was 19 at the time, full of restless ideas and half-written pages scattered around my desk, clumsy attempts at a novel that no one except me seemed to believe in. I wasn't the athletic one, nor the straight A student like my sister. I was the one who scribbled stories late into the night, drinking lukewarm coffee and staring at a blinking cursor as though it might betray me. To my dad, that wasn't ambition. To him, it was foolishness. He'd grown up in a world where success meant hard hats, overtime pay, and tangible proof you could hold in your hands. Words? Words were wind, and he made sure I knew it. So when he told me I'd never amount to anything, I laughed on the outside but broke apart inside. That phrase became the invisible weight I carried into every classroom, every late shift at the bookstore, every hesitant submission of a manuscript. It shaped the way I walked into a room, half defensive, half determined. Yet, here's the twist. Words are stubborn things. They can wound, yes, but they can also heal, and sometimes they become fuel. The more I heard his voice dismiss me, the harder I pressed the pen to paper. Until one afternoon, years later, when the email came, the one that changed everything. The one with the words I had almost given up hoping to see. We'd like to offer you a publishing deal. The timing? I'll never forget it. Because the first time I read that email was the same week I zipped up my graduation gown. And in that moment, walking across the campus lawn with the contract folded neatly in my pocket, I knew that every doubt, every sting, every sleepless night had led me exactly there. What I didn't know then was that graduation would not only change how my father saw me, it would change how I saw him. Sometimes the very words meant to break you become the seed of your strength. Growing up in my father's house was like living under a set of unwritten rules. He wasn't cruel, not in the way that leaves visible scars, but his standards pressed down on you like gravity. He believed in discipline, not encouragement. In his mind, compliments softened people, and softness was dangerous in a world that demanded toughness. My older sister, Emily, thrived under that system. She excelled in math and science, ticking all the boxes my father respected: scholarships, awards, and eventually a career in engineering. When she came home with medals and certificates, Dad's chest swelled with pride. He framed her achievements and hung them on the living room wall, a shrine to measurable success. Me? I was different. I lived for words, for stories that spilled out of me whether I wanted them to or not. I filled spiral notebooks with characters, fragments of dialogue, half-finished poems. But to my father, writing was a hobby at best, a distraction at worst. If Emily was the golden child, I was the dreamer, the one who needed a reality check. It wasn't that he hated me. He just couldn't see me. He didn't understand that the same grit he admired in Emily showed up in me, just in a different form. He saw me sitting for hours at my desk, and he mistook it for idleness, not realizing that every keystroke was an act of quiet rebellion. There were moments when I tried to bridge the gap. I once left a short story on the kitchen counter, hoping he might pick it up. He did. He read the first page, set it down, and said, "It doesn't pay the bills." That was his verdict. After that, I stopped leaving things out. I wrote in silence, hoarding my words like contraband. My mother stayed mostly neutral, caught between my father's sternness and my need for approval. She'd sneak into my room sometimes, sit on the edge of the bed, and say things like, "Don't give up, honey. Some flowers take longer to bloom." But her voice was always soft, almost whispered, as if she was afraid he might overhear. Those years shaped me in ways I didn't yet understand. Because when someone you love insists you'll never make anything of yourself, you have two choices: accept it or prove them wrong. And that choice, though I didn't know it yet, would become the test that defined everything. The breaking point came during my sophomore year of college. I was home for a long weekend, sitting at the same kitchen table where my father had first delivered that sentence that haunted me. He asked the usual questions about my classes, but his tone was less curiosity and more interrogation. "So, what are you studying again?" he said, stabbing at his eggs with his fork. "English," I replied, trying to sound confident. English, he repeated, as though the word itself tasted sour. And what exactly do you plan to do with that? I mumbled something about teaching, maybe editing, but my heart wasn't in it. The truth was, I wanted to write books. I wanted to create worlds that people could step into and feel less alone. But I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud to him. He leaned back in his chair and gave me that look, the one that said he already had me figured out. Let me tell you something, son. Life doesn't hand out trophies for dreamers. You want to make something of yourself? Get a job that pays. Otherwise, you'll be living in my basement until you're 40. That was the inciting blow. That was the morning I went upstairs, shut the door to my old room, and stared at the pile of notebooks stacked in the corner. And I made a decision. If I was going to chase this thing, this fragile, foolish dream of becoming a writer, then I needed to set my own rules. I couldn't rely on my father's approval, and I couldn't afford to crumble every time he dismissed me. So I created a test for myself, a pact of sorts. Rule 1. Write every single day, no matter how tired or discouraged I felt. Rule 2. Finish what I started. No more half-finished stories collecting dust. Rule 3. Submit my work, even if rejection felt like death. It was my secret contract, one my father would never know about. But to me, it was sacred. It gave me a way to measure myself not against his standards, not against Emily's trophies, but against the promise I'd made to my own stubborn heart. I taped a small key to my desk lamp that night. Not a metaphorical one, a real, tiny brass key I'd found years earlier in the junk drawer. It didn't open anything, but it became my symbol. Every time I sat down to write, I touched it. A reminder that the lock I was trying to open wasn't out there. It was inside me. I didn't know it then, but that little key would follow me through every twist and turn that came next. Because the real test wasn't whether I could write a book. The real test was whether I could keep believing in myself when the one man I wanted approval from most refused to give it. And so the game began. Those next 2 years were like living in 2 different worlds. By day, I was the dutiful student, showing up for lectures, taking notes, writing essays that quoted all the right authors. But by night, I was living a secret life, an underground life, where my desk lamp glowed long after my roommates had gone to bed. That's when I chased the real work, the stories that came to me like whispers I couldn't ignore. The key sat beside me, always. I'd twist it between my fingers during moments of doubt, as though it might unlock some hidden door in my brain. And maybe, in a way, it did. Because every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the vow I had made at that kitchen table. But the puzzles weren't just on the page. Life threw me its share of riddles too. Money for one. I couldn't afford to be a starving artist, not in the literal sense. So I took a job at the campus bookstore. It wasn't glamorous, stacking shelves, ringing up customers, restocking coffee, but it put me in the very place that reminded me why I was fighting, surrounded by books. Sometimes, during slow shifts, I'd slip my own scribbled pages between the covers of bestsellers, imagining a stranger stumbling across them one day. Rejection was another puzzle. I sent out short stories to every literary magazine I could find. Most came back with a curt, "Thank you, but not for us." Some didn't come back at all. Each rejection slipped under my skin like a splinter, but I refused to let it fester. I made a rule. Every no had to be answered with 2 new submissions. It was a strange sort of math, but it kept me moving. And then there was the puzzle of silence. My father never asked about my writing. He'd call sometimes to check in, but his questions were always the same. Are you eating enough? Got a job lined up yet? He never once asked, how's the book? Part of me wanted to shove the pages under his nose and demand recognition. But another part of me realized something crucial. I wasn't writing to prove him wrong anymore. I was writing because, without it, I didn't feel like myself. Still, the tension between us hung heavy. Every family dinner, every holiday visit, it was there, his unspoken disapproval, my unspoken determination. It was like playing chess without a board. Every move, every word was loaded, even in silence. The funny thing is, puzzles only reveal their answers when you're patient enough to keep turning them around in your hands. And just when I thought I was spinning my wheels, just when I was convinced I was destined to keep collecting rejection letters like scars, something unexpected cracked open. The puzzle was about to shift into something far bigger than I'd imagined. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was in the campus library, halfway through revising yet another story that I secretly suspected would never see daylight. My phone buzzed. At first, I ignored it. Calls during the day usually meant telemarketers or my father reminding me that real jobs don't wait. But then I saw the email notification. The subject line was short, almost anticlimactic: submission response. My heart stuttered. I had sent out so many submissions that they blurred together, but I clicked it open with the same ritual mixture of dread and hope. I braced myself for the familiar line. "Thank you for your submission, but..." Only this time, the words were different. "We are thrilled to inform you that we would like to acquire your manuscript for publication." I read it once, then again and again. My first thought wasn't triumph. It was disbelief. I kept waiting for the catch, the cruel twist, the line where they told me I'd misread. But no, the deal was real. An actual publishing house wanted my book. I sat frozen in that library chair, hands trembling over the keyboard, as the realization settled over me. All those nights alone with the key, all those rejected stories, all those moments I nearly quit, it hadn't been wasted. The universe had answered. I remember walking outside into the late autumn air, the trees shedding their last leaves, the world looking somehow sharper, brighter. People hurried past, heads down, unaware that my life had just split into before and after. I wanted to stop them, to say, "Look at me, I made it. I'm not invisible anymore." But then the second realization hit me like a cold gust. My father. How would I tell him? Did I even want to? Would he shrug it off, call it luck, or worse, dismiss it entirely? For years, I had craved his approval. Now, I held in my hands something that proved I didn't need it. Yet part of me still longed to see his expression when I told him. Part of me wanted to walk into that living room, lay the contract on the coffee table, and say, "See, words pay bills too." And as fate would have it, I wouldn't need to choose, because graduation was coming in just a few weeks. And at that ceremony, with my name being called, my cap tassel swinging, and my book deal folded neatly in my pocket, I knew our worlds were about to collide in a way neither of us could escape. The revelation wasn't just that I had achieved what he said I never could. It was that the story wasn't finished. The real chapter, his reaction, our reckoning, was still to come. The victory was mine, but the battle was waiting. The weeks leading up to graduation should have been nothing but joy. Friends were planning parties, classmates were decorating their caps, everyone buzzing with the electric promise of life after college. And though I smiled and nodded along, inside I carried a knot of dread. Because graduation meant family. Family meant my father. And my father meant confrontation. I had told no one about the book deal yet, not even my mother. I wanted the moment to matter, and I wanted to control how it unfolded. But the silence gnawed at me. At night, when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I imagined every possible scenario. Dad laughing it off. Dad calling it a fluke. Dad folding his arms the way he always did and saying, "One book doesn't make a career." Worse, what if he said nothing at all? What if my proudest moment evaporated in his silence, as though it didn't exist? Meanwhile, other tensions pressed in. The publishing contract itself came with deadlines, edits, expectations that felt both thrilling and terrifying. For every burst of excitement, there was an undercurrent of fear. What if I can't deliver? What if Dad is right after all? And then came the family dinner the night before graduation. We gathered at my parents' house, the familiar scent of roast chicken filling the air. Emily sat at the table, glowing in her engineer's confidence, updating everyone about her latest project. Dad hung on her every word, nodding with approval. Then he turned to me. "So, what's next for you?" The question was casual, almost polite, but I felt the weight behind it. I wanted to blurt it out right then. "I have a book deal. I'm not a failure." But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I mumbled something vague about opportunities and possibilities. Dad narrowed his eyes, but didn't press. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. That night, I couldn't sleep. I pulled the small brass key from my bag and held it in my palm. It had been my quiet companion for years, but now it felt heavier, almost alive, as if it knew the moment it had been waiting for was nearly here. Graduation day arrived with sunshine and restless energy. The campus buzzed with families taking photos, professors shaking hands, laughter echoing across the green lawns. I walked across the stage, my name echoing in the microphone, the diploma firm in my hand. And tucked inside my gown pocket, the contract waited. When the ceremony ended, I spotted them, my father, my mother, and Emily, standing near the fountain. My father's arms were crossed, his default posture, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. This was it, the crossroads. And as I walked toward them, my heart pounding, I knew I couldn't keep the secret any longer. But I also knew the way he reacted would change everything. The test wasn't over. It was only beginning. I can still see the sunlight glinting off the fountain that afternoon, families swarming around us, the air filled with camera shutters and bursts of laughter. Yet in my small corner of the lawn, time slowed to a crawl. My father stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set in its usual firm line, while my mother hovered beside him, smiling but cautious. Emily had her phone out, already snapping pictures. I walked up to them, diploma in one hand, the other brushing against the folded contract hidden in my pocket. My throat tightened. This was the moment I had rehearsed in my head 100 times. How I'd tell him, how he'd react, how years of distance might close with a single sentence. "Congratulations, son," he said first, almost formal. No hug, no clap on the back, just words that sounded more like an obligation than pride. "Thanks," I replied, my voice thin. Emily chimed in with her usual sparkle. "We're proud of you." She hugged me hard, and for a moment I let myself breathe in her warmth. But as she pulled away, my father's silence filled the space again. That's when I knew I had to do it. If I walked away without saying anything, I'd regret it forever. So I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the contract and held it out toward him. "Dad, I wanted you to see this." He frowned, taking the paper like it might bite him. His eyes moved across the words, slower than I expected. My mother leaned in, curious. Emily stepped closer too. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up. "What is this?" "It's a publishing contract," I said, my voice steadying as I spoke. "They're going to publish my book." There it was, the truth laid bare in the open. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a long moment, he just stared at me. No smile, no frown, just silence. The kind of silence that had defined so much of my life with him. And then he laughed, quietly, almost incredulously. "A book deal," he repeated, shaking his head. Well, I'll be damned. It wasn't joy. It wasn't pride. It was disbelief laced with something I couldn't quite name. But at least it wasn't dismissal. At least he hadn't turned away. I swallowed hard. "You said I'd never make anything of myself. But I did this, Dad. I made this happen." The air between us tightened. My mother looked at him, waiting. Emily bit her lip, as if she knew the stakes. And in that moment, as the fountain splashed and strangers around us cheered for their own graduates, my father and I stood in a standoff years in the making. What he said next would either shatter me or change everything. For a heartbeat, the world held still. My father's hands gripped the contract as though it might vanish if he let go. His eyes, usually so guarded, flickered with something unfamiliar, a hesitation, a crack in the armor. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, not sharp, not dismissive, but almost weary. "I didn't think you'd stick with it. Not this long. Not enough to get here." I opened my mouth to argue, to remind him of every cruel phrase, every dismissal, every time he said my words would never pay the bills. But I didn't. Because beneath his roughness, I heard something else for the very first time. Admission. He hadn't believed in me, but now he couldn't deny what was in front of him. He looked down at the page again, then back at me. His jaw worked as though the words he wanted to say were stuck. At last, he muttered, almost grudgingly, "Maybe I was wrong." Those 4 words hit harder than anything else he could have said. Not an apology, not an embrace. But for my father, it was the closest thing. And I realized then that I didn't need him to kneel in admiration. What I needed was acknowledgement. And I had it. My mother's eyes filled with quiet tears. Emily let out a sigh of relief, the tension between us easing just a little. But inside me, something much larger shifted. Because in that moment, I understood. The real victory wasn't proving him wrong. It was proving to myself that I could keep going even when he never believed. That little brass key I had carried, the one that had guided me through every sleepless night, had never been about unlocking his approval. It had always been about unlocking my own strength. I slipped it back into my pocket, next to the contract. 2 symbols side by side. The dream I had fought for, and the strength that had made it possible. Graduation photos were taken, Laughter bubbled up, and life carried on around us. But in the quiet undercurrent of that afternoon, a chapter closed. Not with fireworks, not with a cinematic hug, but with something simpler, something real. Respect, however imperfect, beginning to take root. And that respect, fragile as it was, changed everything. Sometimes the legacy of our battles isn't the prize we win, but the person we become in the fight. Life after graduation moved quickly. Edits, deadlines, long nights at my desk. All the things I had once dreamed of suddenly became real responsibilities. And yet, each time I sat down to write, I touched that small brass key and remembered why I had started. Not for applause, not for approval, but because words were the truest part of me. My book came out the following year. It didn't top bestseller lists or earn me fame overnight, but it was mine. Real, tangible, printed on shelves I had once stocked as a bookstore clerk. Friends bought copies, professors sent congratulations, and strangers reached out to say, "Your story made me feel seen." That was worth more than any paycheck. And my father? He never became effusive, never showered me with praise. But one day, when I visited home, I noticed something small but unmistakable. On the living room shelf, among Emily's framed diplomas and medals, sat my book, propped up neatly, as if it belonged there. He never mentioned putting it there, and I never asked. But I understood what it meant. We never erased the years of friction, but we found a new rhythm, less about proving, more about accepting. His language softened, if only slightly. And mine too. I stopped needing him to validate me, because I had already done the hardest work, believing in myself when it mattered most. That's the thing about scars. They don't vanish, but they remind you of the battles you survived. My father's doubt had cut deep, but it had also forged my determination. What he meant to break me ended up making me. And every time I see that book spine on his shelf, I know the boy he said would never make anything of himself did. So if you've ever carried someone's words like a stone in your chest, let me leave you with this. You don't have to drop the stone. You can build with it. You can turn it into a step. And sometimes, the very phrase meant to hold you down becomes the key that sets you free. Because in the end, it isn't about who doubts you. It's about who you decide to be when they do.